Hi everyone, welcome to Selling to Healthcare. I'm Lisa Miller. I've spent over 30 years in healthcare sales, from building lasting partnerships to driving real results for hospitals and health systems. And I'm here to share what I've learned about leading with service and how that can change the game for you no matter where you are in your career. Lately, I've been thinking about what separates the sellers who get the first meeting from the ones who keep getting called back. And it's something that, honestly, I don't think gets talked about enough. So today I want to talk about something that, I think is probably the number one reason sellers fail at the executive level. And it's not their offer, it's not their product, it's not even their relationships, although, of course you do need those. It's that they haven't done the invisible work before they ever walk in the room, right? And I'm going to be a straight shooter here, right? Like, executives don't buy features, they buy outcomes, consequences, and clarity. And if you can't frame what's broken and what's possible better than they can, you don't belong in the room. That's just the truth. So I'll start with, what I think is the core problem here. And I think this is where most sellers really fall short. It's not because they lack a good offer. It's because they've only trained themselves to talk about what's immediately visible, right? They show up with a service or even a great product, but, no perspective, no real clarity about the bigger picture. And, at the executive level, I think the conversation really isn't about features or deliverables. It's about consequences. It's about understanding what happens across the business when your offer takes root, like how it affects workflows, budgets, power dynamics, reputational risks, executive credibility. If you can't see those ripple effects, you're not just underprepared, you're probably underpriced because, your client doesn't need a better tool. They need someone who can help them, reimagine the way forward. And I think that's why thinking deeper isn't just like a mindset upgrade, it's a sales strategy. So here's where I think most of the industry gets stuck. They're trapped in what I call maze thinking. It's this tight little loop of small promises and feature comparisons, right? And everyone's stuck in the maze, is just fighting to be 10% better than the next guy. But executives aren't in the maze, they're above it, right? They're trying to decide whether the maze even matters anymore. So thinking deeper means you stop trying to prove that your offer is slightly better, right? And you start showing them that like their frame is outdated, that the system they're optimizing is actually the very thing holding them back. You stop saying, here's how we help, and you start asking, like, what if you didn't need that system at all? And I think that's when the real conversation actually starts. And, I think about people trying to reach, let's say again, the CFO, and the thing they get wrong is that just because you're going to save them money, no risk offer, like automatically they should be like, absolutely yes. But in reality, there's so many more metrics. They're looking at managing risk, bringing opportunity, reducing cost, but also what happens if this goes wrong? Their brand reputation, are they picking the right partner? So there's a lot more to that that I think people miss. And most sellers, they show up with these surface level value props like, we'll save you money, we'll improve efficiency. But executives have heard that line 100 times, right? What they haven't heard is somebody who has a point of view that, actually cuts through the noise, that names what's truly broken and frames the problem in a way they haven't considered but can't ignore once they see it. And I think if consultative selling is the vehicle, then insight is the engine, right? And insight doesn't just help you win the meeting, it actually helps you understand what your offer is worth. So if you want that kind of understanding, you need more than industry knowledge, you need proximity. And honestly, I think proximity is probably the single most overlooked principle in high value consulting. stay close to the work, not just the meetings, not the strategy decks, the actual work, like what's happening in the team, in the tools, in the decision loops. So when I was running my consulting firm, I stayed close to the client's work, not just to deliver results, but to actually witness what happened when the work landed. Because from a distance, everything looks clean, right? The process maps make sense, the slide decks are persuasive, but proximity tells a different story. And when you're embedded enough to see how a recommendation lives inside the day-to-day, you start noticing everything that, doesn't show up in the plan. I saw workflows that, sounded efficient on paper, but created bottlenecks in practice. I saw tools that were supposed to save time, but actually drain morale, leadership assumptions that made perfect sense in theory, but just collapse under operational reality. And in almost every case, the real value wasn't in what we built. It was in what we removed, right? Like the drag we eliminated, the decisions we made easier, the clarity we restored. And that's what proximity gives you, not just insight, but accuracy, right? It sharpens your intuition. It helps you, predict friction before it hits. And most importantly, I think it builds trust because clients can feel when you're solving the real problem, not just the one they described in the RFP. A lot of people think that to scale, you need distance. I think the opposite. The more embedded you are, the more undeniable your value becomes. And that's what gives you pricing power. That's what creates internal champions. And it makes your presence feel, less like a cost and more like an advantage they can't afford to lose. And you start to notice what's outdated, what's duplicative, what's slowing everything down. And instead of tweaking the current setup, you start designing solutions that leap past it. And when you understand the second and third order consequences of your solution, not just what it is, but what it unlocks, you start to see the full size of what you're selling. And so does the client. And that's when, your pitch gets sharper, your proposal stops sounding like persuasion and start reading like strategy, because you're not just describing a better tool, you're offering a smarter future, and you've thought about it more deeply than anyone else in the room. So, okay, here's the thing. Once you have that depth of thinking, once you have that proximity, the question becomes, what do you do with it? How do you turn it into something durable? And that's where foundational thought leadership comes in. So the way I approach foundational thought leadership, it's really an act of synthesis, not persuasion, right? Like when I write a primary thought leadership piece for hospital executives, the goal is to introduce a way of understanding the environment they operate in, grounded in evidence across clinical performance, business operations, and financial accountability. And this isn't content designed to, capture attention in a crowded feed. It's designed to be durable, referenceable, and useful over time. And I think this is important. Hospital executives are, by nature, they're builders, right? They choose roles defined by complexity, trade-offs, and long-time horizons because they want to shape systems that matter. They're intellectually curious, but their curiosity is, I think, really disciplined. It's oriented toward understanding how, forces outside the organization are changing what leadership inside the organization requires. So I think a core thought leadership piece should respect that and assume sophistication. Like it shouldn't try to create urgency where none exists. Its value comes from helping an executive see a familiar challenge more clearly by connecting domains that are usually considered separately. So let me walk you through how I actually do this. There's really 5 steps to how I build a foundational thought leadership piece. So step 1 is finding insight before it becomes obvious. And, the most important decision I make when creating a core thought leadership piece is actually what not to read. I stay away from blogs, opinion pieces, recycled commentary, not because they lack intelligence, but because they tend to flatten complexity. Like by the time an idea appears repeatedly in commentary, it has usually already lost the nuance that makes it useful to senior leaders. Instead, I work across primary sources that sit at different altitudes of the system, so CMS rulemaking and sub-regulatory guidance to understand how accountability is being defined, hospital costs and utilization data, earnings calls, and financial disclosures from for-profit health systems, to hear how executives explain results when they're accountable to markets, and peer-reviewed clinical research to understand what actually changes outcomes. And what I'm looking for is not agreement across these sources, right? I'm looking for misalignment. And that misalignment, that's the signal. It shows up when, clinical evidence points in one direction, operational practice lags behind, and financial accountability quietly moves anyway. And when you see that same tension from multiple vantage points, it stops being academic, it becomes strategic. So, bundled payment guidance is a really good example of this. On the surface, it describes program mechanics, but if you read closely, something else emerges. Hospitals are no longer being evaluated solely on the care they deliver inside their walls, right? They're being judged on whether recovery itself is shaped, supported, and stabilized after discharge. And that expectation isn't announced, it's embedded. And when you surface an embedded expectation like that and you connect it to clinical outcomes, operating models, and financial exposure, you're no longer offering commentary. You're giving executives information they can use to actually run the organization differently. And I think that's the difference between content and foundational thought leadership. I know that sounds like a lot of work, right? But this is how I operate. I'm a deep researcher. I write a lot, and things I write aren't things that I publish. I'm writing so that, it helps me think, it helps me put together my frameworks, it helps me get clarity. So it's not like I'm just reading these sources and, checking a box. I'm wrestling with them. I'm looking for the thing that doesn't fit. So step 2 is naming the implication others miss. And I think the goal of research is not to confirm what everyone already knows, right? It's to find the implication that hasn't been fully articulated. So in the case of, financial performance, the under-discussed insight is that recovery is no longer downstream. It's upstream to margin, quality scores, and long-term service line economics. Most hospitals still organize around episodes that end at discharge, but policy and reimbursement logic, they've already moved past that. And that's the kind of nuance that executives actually engage with. Step 3, and this one is, I think, really, really important, right? Like a decision maker, not like a marketer. So once the insight is clear, the work shifts from analysis to judgment, right? And at this point, I'm no longer writing to inform, I'm writing to mirror how senior executives actually reason through choices. That means the language on page has to resemble the language used in, operating reviews, capital allocation discussions, board conversations. I'm not, describing possibilities. I'm defining implications. So the writing is structured around what changes if this insight is taken seriously and what doesn't change if it's ignored, right? Like, where does risk begin to accumulate? Where does performance become harder to predict? Where do existing investments start to deliver diminishing returns because the environment they were designed for no longer exists? And this is, exactly why I don't lead with benefit, because when you frame something as a benefit, you're basically asking somebody to just believe you. But when you frame it as a decision, you're asking them to think. And that's where executives actually engage. And I think, executives don't need you to convince them that something matters. They need to see how it changes the decisions that are actually on their plate. And when the writing does that well, creates clarity without instruction and urgency without exaggeration. So step 4 is teach the shift, not the answer. And I think this is where a lot of people get it wrong. Foundational thought leadership is not where solutions are announced, right? It's where mental models get updated. I show how yesterday's logic produced today's results and why tomorrow's environment will reward different decisions. I connect policy, finance, and operations without, oversimplifying any of them. And I think that's really where insight lives. And then step 5, the last one, is end with directional tension. And the purpose of a foundational thought leadership piece isn't to resolve the issue it introduces, right? It's to leave the reader with a clear understanding of the constraint they now operate within. And hospitals are increasingly evaluated outcomes that extend well beyond the point where traditional management systems stop, right? And that creates this growing gap between responsibility and control. And that tension, it doesn't call for urgency or optimism. It calls for leadership. And when a piece ends that way, it stays with the executive, not as an idea, but as a question that must eventually be answered in strategy, in structure, and in investment decisions. Now, I want to come back to something that, fuels all of this, because the 5-step process I just walked you through, it doesn't work if you haven't done the deeper thinking first. I think one of the most unobvious things that it takes to do my work well that people underestimate is the amount of thinking time that I put in. And look, I know people love this idea that, great ideas just come to you out of nowhere, but it's how it works for me. For me, it's the hours of research, it's the frameworks, it's honestly just refusing to move on from a problem until I've really, really gotten to the bottom of it. And, thinking time isn't some soft productivity hack. For me, it's been one of the most important things I do. And I actually started scheduling it after hearing a story that really stuck with me. So Keith Cunningham has been a mentor of mine. He's a very well-known business strategist, works with businesses across the world. He once shared a story about pitching to an investor. And after the meeting, the investor just said, "My next thinking time is Thursday at 4 a.m. I'll decide after that." That was it. No follow-up, no spreadsheet, just thinking time. So I made it non-negotiable. Once a week, I sit down with nothing but a pen, a question, and 0 distractions. Sometimes it's, what do my best clients wish someone would solve for them? Other times it's, what assumptions are they trapped in? What breakthrough am I sitting on that I haven't given the space to surface? It doesn't always lead somewhere obvious, but it always sharpens me. The thing is, right, the single most important idea I've ever had for my business, the one that literally changed our valuation, it didn't happen in a meeting or on a call. It happened during thinking time, just me and a blank page. And this connects to something else I really want to hit on, which is reaching out without the pitch. I've learned that the best way to stay top of mind with senior executives isn't by pitching them, it's by thinking about them literally, taking the time to sit with their business in my mind, turning it over, asking, what haven't they seen yet? What's sitting right in front of them that no one has dared to say? I have a great story about this. So there was a major consulting firm that honestly nobody even liked working with. And a friend of mine asked the client, why do you keep renewing with them? And the answer was so simple. They bring us big ideas every quarter. That was it. That's it. Not results, not amazing delivery, just perspective. They made themselves, useful by thinking. That stuck with me. Every so often, I'll reach out to a client, no agenda, no deck, no proposal, and say something like, I've been thinking about your business. I notice a few things I think are worth unpacking. Not selling you anything, just thought it might be worth a quick chat. they always say yes, always, because, people are starving for someone who will actually give them a real perspective without trying to sell them something. You don't need to be selling to create momentum. Sometimes the most powerful move is to show someone that you're still thinking about them, even when there's nothing on the table. That's what builds trust. That's what gets remembered. That's what leads to deals. So, okay, let me kind of pull all of this together, right? Because I think the big picture here is really important. Thought leadership for hospital executives is not created by having a louder point of view, right? It's created by doing the harder work, like reading the system as it actually operates across clinical evidence, operational reality, and financial accountability, and then naming the implications before they become obvious. And when done well, this kind of writing doesn't tell executives what to think or what to do. It gives them a clearer frame for understanding the decisions they're already responsible for and the constraints they can no longer ignore. But none of that happens without the deep thinking first, without the proximity, without the discipline of carving out that thinking time and actually doing the work of, wrestling with a hard question before you ever put pen to paper. So before you walk into your next executive conversation, ask yourself, do you know what's broken, not just what's inconvenient? Can you speak to the cost of that problem, not just in dollars, but in operational drag, team behavior, decision bottlenecks, and missed opportunities? Have you developed a perspective they haven't heard before but can't unsee once they hear it? Because if you can do that, you're not there to sell a product. You're there to, build a new possibility for them. You're not offering improvement. You're offering something at a completely different level. And when you show up with that kind of insight, pricing becomes easy, differentiation becomes obvious. By the way, if you've done all of this right, the deal is closed before you even send the proposal. That's how this works. You don't just win because your solution works. You win because your thinking, makes everything else feel obsolete. So if you'd like to see how I implement this inside commercial teams, I run an immersive selling to the C-suite program that includes assessment, strategy building, workshop, and in-field reinforcement. Check the show notes. I've got some free resources in there for you that go deeper on all of this. That's it for this episode of Selling to Healthcare. I'm Lisa Miller. I'll be back next week with more strategies to help you sell smarter and stand out. Until next time.